Hello everyone and welcome back. In this lecture we're going to talk about selected material from chapter 9 of our text. In this chapter we focus on sleep. In order to learn about sleep, we can do what are called sleep studies. In a sleep study, someone will come into a medical environment, typically a clinic or a hospital setting, and they will set up what is called a polysomnogram. And this consists of several different electrodes that are placed in certain areas of the body that will record activity throughout the person's sleep. The first of which is called the EEG for short, or the electroencephalogram. This is going to measure brainwave activity. Then we have the EMG, which is the electromyogram. This is going to measure a variety of different muscle activity throughout the sleep duration as well. And then finally the EOG, which is the electrooculogram. This is going to measure eye movements throughout the session of sleep in the patient. The results of a sleep study can be recorded in such a way as what we see on the right-hand side of the screen here. This is measurement from that's collected from an EEG. So what this will do is measure what we call different stages of sleep throughout the duration of sleep throughout the night. The first stage of sleep is called wakeful sleep. This consists of what we refer to as alpha activity. So during this time, the person is typically resting quietly. They're not engaged in any strenuous mental activity, but they aren't fully asleep yet. We can see that that activity is charted here by an EEG on the right-hand side of our slide here. So what you'll see is a lot of different bouncing around of the EEG, but you'll see that the activity here is really close together. So you see the up and down, the spikes and dips here are really close together during alpha activity. So this is indicating that there's a fair bit of activity, and you can see that measured in hertz here, 8 to 12 hertz. Then we get to beta activity. So this is a bit more of an alert state. So this is, as you can see, a higher range of hertz here, so 13 to 30 hertz. So you can see that there are even more what we call like valleys and peaks here in the EEG data. So you see more of the ups and downs happening in a certain period of time. So what this is telling us is that the person is more likely to be engaged in active thinking. Then we get to stage 1 of sleep, which is called non-REM sleep, or non-rapid eye movement sleep. So if you'll notice here, what we have here is called theta activity. So the hertz and measurement has dropped down from the alpha and beta levels. So instead of anywhere from 8 to 30 hertz, now we're down to 3.5 to 7.5 hertz. So we have more space between the ups and the downs on the EEG readout of the patient in the sleep study. So notice that the activity is slowing here. What we see during stage 1 is typically some eye rolling happening, maybe some muscle twitching. This is not rapid eye movement sleep. This is also not deep sleep yet. This is kind of the transition between being awake and asleep. Then from stage 1, the person will move into stage 2 sleep. Stage 2 sleep in the EEG readout, so again, this is measuring brain activity, right? In stage 2, we're seeing what are called sleep spindles and K complexes. So what you'll see here, for example, here is a K complex. You'll see the activity go way up and then drop way down. The K complexes, again, are these sharper waveforms. We think that these are associated with what's called neural inhibition. This is only found in stage 2 sleep, and it seems to be kind of a precursor right before someone moves into stage 3. It could be a way of keeping someone from waking up. That's one possibility. Then we also have these little sleep spindles as well. So you can see that here earlier on in the stage 2 readout. These are found throughout stage 1 to stage 3 sleep. And what these are is just kind of more of a burst of activity, a quick burst of activity. So you see the line here becoming very dark, and there's a lot of bouncing around in a short period of time. This short burst of activity has been correlated to something called memory consolidation, as we mentioned earlier in the semester. So that's kind of solidifying a memory. It's also been correlated with better scores on IQ tests, as a fun little side fact. So from stage 2, which again consists of a lot of sleep spindles and K complexes, we then finally move into stage 3. This is where we finally see what's called delta activity. So this is slow wave sleep. So here we have hertz of less than 3.5. So what you'll notice is there's a lot of space between the ups and the downs on the readouts and the EEG. So there's not a lot of rapid activity here. It's all very slow activity. This is when the person who is in the sleep state, the sleep study is in what we call a sound sleep. You can also think about it as kind of being more of a deep sleep. If someone is to wake up during this stage of sleep, that person may not even remember waking up. If you're someone who wears a fitness band, you may record or track your sleep, and you may notice if you look at your sleep data throughout the night, you may see that you, according to your watch, woke up a few times in the night, but you may not remember that at all. It could be that you woke up in the middle of stage 3 sleep. And then the last sleep stage is what we call REM sleep, or rapid eye movement sleep. This is a kind of a mixture of hertz and in terms of measurement of waves. It kind of consists of a mixture of theta and beta waves. So being a bit more awake, and then stage 1 sleep. What happens during this is quite interesting. The EMG, so the electromusculogram that's measuring muscle movements, is silent. So the person in the sleep study is essentially paralyzed during this. They're not moving any of their muscles. The spinal and cranial motor neurons in particular are strongly inhibited. So there is no movement of the body, muscles in particular. But during this time, the brain, as you can see from the EEG, is very, very active. You see a lot of bouncing around here, higher measurements of hertz. So there's a lot of brain activity being recorded during REM sleep by the EEG, but there's no EMG activity. Now, the EOG, the oculogram that's measuring eye movements, does record activity. It is possible during the stage of sleep that the person may be woken up. They may awaken to stimuli. And if this happens, interestingly, a lot of times they'll be fairly alert and attentive. So if they were to wake up out of REM sleep, they may actually wake up and be almost immediately aware of kind of what's going on and trying to attend to the situation. Now, if we take a look at when the stages of sleep happen throughout the duration of a session of sleep, most of the deep sleep, or that slow wave, low measurement of hertz sleep, seems to happen early on in the sleep duration. So this is a excerpt from your book. If we look here, we have slow wave sleep, and if you notice here we're looking at the EEG stage. So wakeful state, stage 1 sleep, stage 2 sleep, and then there we go, stage 3 sleep, which is the deep sleep, the sound sleep. And as we see, the person starts out fairly wakeful, stair steps down to stage 1, stage 2, and then down into slow wave sleep. And then they come back up into what we call REM sleep, these little peaks here that are, again, that mixture of theta and beta waves, that more wakeful state. So we see that here. and then they stair step back down again into slow wave sleep. But then as you notice, first of all, the movement between sleep stages does kind of come and go throughout the night. So the person's not going into slow wave sleep and staying there. What you see is kind of ups and downs throughout the night. But something to notice that the slow wave sleep typically is occurring earlier on in the first half of a sleep duration. And then what we find is more stage 2 and then REM sleep tend to occur a little bit later on in the sleep duration. Now for fun, I've included here the figure that we were just taking a look at from your textbook right here, along with 3 different nights of my own sleep as recorded by my fitness watch. So if you take a look at the patterns of my own sleep and compare them to your figure in your book, mine look a lot like the figure in the book. As you can see, as you would expect, I start off awake, and then, I stair step down into light sleep and then into deep sleep. So if you notice, my deep sleep is occurring in the first half of my sleep sessions. And as you notice, as I mentioned, as we were going through the different stages of sleep, occasionally you may wake up in the night, but you may not know that you did. So that an example of that would be right here. On this particular night, something must have woken me up, but I have no recollection of that at all. So it's likely that I was woken up out of a deep sleep. And actually the data support that. If we look at the chart, it seems as though I had just went into deep sleep and then I don't know, maybe something happened, some noise, I'm not sure, must have woken me up for a bit, and then I fall back asleep. But I have no memory of that wakeful period because I was awakened out of a deep sleep. So things to note overall is that the sleep stages seem to, we move in and out of them throughout the night. Deep sleep or slow wave sleep seems to happen more in the beginning stages of sleep. And REM sleep tends to happen more in the latter half of the sleep session. And finally, and most importantly, you're learning right now that your professor is finally showing her age because she wakes up at 5 or 5:30 every morning. Yeah. I think this might be why I like coffee, guys. This is kind of an interesting little test. If you all record your own sleep with your own fitness watch, take a look at your own sleep and compare it to this figure as well and see if you look similar. Okay, so let's chat a little bit more about REM sleep and dreaming. So as we know, during REM sleep, there seems to be, again, there's no muscle movement going on because the person is paralyzed at the time, but there's a lot of brain activity. There seems to be a lot of activity in particular in the visual association cortex. Now, what I want to make clear to you all is remember we have V1 and V2, if you'll remember from earlier on in the semester. V1 is that primary visual cortex. So that's the receiving area of any visual information that's coming in through the eyes. And then V2 is the visual association cortex. So that is where information for V1 is moving to in the brain to then allow us to do something with that information. Now note here, high activity in the visual association cortex, or V2. And we think this could be kind of correlated with things like visual hallucinations and stuff that tend to go along with dreams. But, and this makes sense, while there's high activity in V2, or the visual association cortex, there's not any activity in V1 because the person's eyes are not open and they're not actually getting any visual input. So no activity in V1, but a lot of activity in the association cortex of V2. There also seems to be a lot of activation in the prefrontal cortex. And as we know, this area of the brain has been correlated with the activities such as planning and organizing. It also seems to play a role in being able to distinguish reality from illusion. So this particular area of the brain seems to see a fair bit of activity during REM sleep as well. It has been hypothesized that this activity may play a role in what is called lucid dreaming. If you have ever been familiar with lucid dreaming, basically that is where, as described, a person who is dreaming somehow starts to be in control of their own dream. So at some point in time, they realize that they're dreaming, and then they can start actively interacting with the dream. So people in the dream making choices in the dream, basically controlling how the dream goes. For some folks, they report the ability to do this, and it seems as though that might be correlated with, again, more activity in the prefrontal cortex during REM sleep. All know sleep is a basic function that we all need to survive. Sleep deprivation can have a lot of detrimental effects. Something that we know is that the brain needs to rest to kind of counteract the wakeful activity that you are engaged in throughout the day. Your brain needs that sleep to be able to kind of reboot itself. Something that we have found is that it reduces something called oxidative stress. In a nutshell, something called free radicals can build up in the brain. And if you don't sleep enough, then your brain can adequately get rid of that free radical buildup as well as it needs to be able to function optimally. There is a condition called fatal familial insomnia. In this condition, parts of the thalamus of the brain become damaged. It's highly correlated with attention and memory deficits. So in this condition, and again, familial, that will tell you that it's a genetic condition. Basically, the person has insomnia. They don't sleep. And after a while, this causes that damage to the thalamus. It is then noticed that the person has a lot of attention and memory deficits. They tend to walk around in just a kind of a confused, dreamlike state. They don't really know where they are or what's happening, if they're awake or asleep. And towards the end of the disease, there then becomes the loss of really important functions in the body, such as the autonomic nervous system and the endocrine system. There's really no more control over that anymore, and so these systems are just kind of sporadically acting. They're not performing the way that they should. And then eventually the person can't maintain a body temperature. As you all know, average body temperature, they say it's 98.6. There has been some research that suggests that's actually a little high. It should be lower than that. The point being, a healthy person maintains a consistent body temperature. Well, people with this particular disease after a prolonged period can't maintain a healthy body temperature anymore. And typically with a diagnosis like this, the person will be dead within a year. This disease is a really good demonstration of what happens to a person and the different stages that they go through when they don't sleep. Now, they've also explored sleep depth with animals in laboratories, non-human animals in the laboratory. They've induced sleep deprivation in rats, which is something that we're going to talk about when I give a presentation for you all on an article that looked at sleep deprivation in rats, and that will be coming to you in our next content folder. But for now, just know that they have looked at rats in a laboratory environment. They prevented them from sleeping. And what they found with these rats is several different behavioral changes. These rats, first of all, stopped grooming themselves. Secondly, they became more weak and less coordinated. They were more likely to fall or not be able to run on a wheel properly. They also found that, again, much like the patients with familial insomnia, they became unable to regulate their own body temperature. Interestingly, they ate more food, but their metabolic rate also increased. So inevitably, they wound up losing weight. So it seems as though your sleep, as you can imagine, it really just plays a role in almost every bodily function. And this is including metabolic rate. So these rats that weren't able to sleep, they were more hungry, they ate more food, but they still weren't able to maintain a body weight. So they were actually losing weight even though they were consuming more than average food, because their metabolic rate increased so much because they weren't sleeping. And of course, eventually they did die from sleep deprivation. Now, they did a necropsy which is the animal version of a autopsy. And in necropsy, they examined the brain of these rats that were used in these types of studies. And what they found was that the structure of the brain appeared normal. So there weren't any signs of inflammation or damage to any internal organs that they could see. And also, and this might be one that a lot of you all wouldn't expect, but they found that their stress hormones weren't unusually high. So their brain structurally looked normal, organs looked normal, stress hormones looked normal, but yet the behavior before the rat finally expired was not normal. They had all of these things that they stopped doing or were no longer able to do, and then they eventually died from sleep deprivation, yet the internal structures, in large part, looked normal. Now let's take a look at new learning. Let's look at REM sleep and slow wave sleep. We think that these two stages of sleep may facilitate or make it easier for us to learn new tasks. We see, for example, more REM sleep during developmental periods in adolescence. So more of this dreamlike state tends to happen in younger folks. And we also think that REM sleep may help with memory consolidation, so non-declarative memory consolidation. And non-declarative, guys, means episodic memory, so personal memories. We think that REM sleep may be correlated with the memory consolidation for more personal events in one's life. It's hypothesized that the brain may actually rehearse this newly learned information during the deep sleep stage or slow wave sleep. So perhaps the brain solidifies the connections between neurons and pattern of firing becomes more consistent for newly learned information. And we think that this does happen during slow wave sleep. So again, it makes sense why someone in adolescence would have really more sleep in general. Young folks tend to sleep more than older people anyhow, so that makes sense. It also makes sense why maybe young folks would have more of these cycles of REM and slow wave sleep than an older individual. Here we'll take a look at the different neurotransmitters that play a role in sleep and in arousal. So all of these should look familiar to you all after our chapter on psychopharmacology. So first we'll take a look at acetylcholine. If you'll remember, that's an excitatory neurotransmitter. We see high levels of acetylcholine in the hippocampus and in the neocortex during times of waking and REM sleep. So this is going to be time when the brain is more active. We see higher levels of acetylcholine in these brain regions. We also have norepinephrine. We see high levels of it during waking, and then in turn lower levels in slow wave sleep and almost none in REM sleep. So we see more levels of norepinephrine happening during more times of wakefulness, but not during deep sleep. We think that this is correlated with an increase in vigilance, which makes sense if it's in high levels or higher concentrations during wakeful states, but it's largely absent during slow wave sleep and REM sleep. Then we have serotonin. We see most of it happening or occurring in the brain during wakeful times. And again, these are excitatory neurotransmitters. We think that this is related to more automatic movements. Automatic movements are things like chewing, swallowing, things that you're going to be engaged in mostly when you're awake. Then we have histamine. This is high during waking and also low in slow wave and in REM sleep. So similar levels to norepinephrine, for example. And then finally, we have a peptide neurotransmitter. This is called orexin or hypocretin. It depends on who you ask because two different laboratories discovered this peptide neurotransmitter. So it has two different names, one from each lab. We see high levels of this during wakeful states. And this one's really important. We see a degeneration of orexin. And it seems as though that can be a cause or correlated with narcolepsy, which is a sleep disorder that we'll talk about here in a few minutes. Now let's look at a particularly important brain region or brain area. This is called the preoptic area. Here we see it's more toward the bottom of the brain, more at the base of the brain here, which again makes sense because sleep is one of the most basic functions, so it makes sense that it would be in the lower brain region. This is most involved in the actual control of sleep. So in particular, neurons here project axons out that form inhibitory connections with arousal neurons. So neurons that are keeping you awake, neurons in this particular area form connections with those and inhibit those arousal neurons. Most of them secrete GABA, which if you'll remember is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So when these neurons are active, they are going to suppress the arousal neurons by releasing GABA and inhibiting their firing. Slow wave sleep happens when these neurons are particularly active, which makes a lot of sense given what we've discussed thus far in this lecture. Now, this activity happens or is facilitated by a buildup of adenosine. Adenosine is key. The more adenosine that accumulates, which is adenosine accumulates throughout the day, the more of it that we have, the more we're going to see activity of these inhibitory neurons that's going to make us tired. So this is particularly happening on the receptor A1 for adenosine. But think about it. So we have adenosine that it's accumulating throughout the day. The more that we have of that, the more these inhibitory neurons that produce GABA become active and make us sleepy. This is why during later periods of the day, we start to feel more and more tired. Now, interestingly, here comes caffeine. What caffeine does is actually block A1 receptors. So adenosine can't bind with those A1 receptors. And what that means then is that these inhibitory neurons don't fire. That's why caffeine makes you more awake or more alert, because these inhibitory neurons that release GABA aren't active because adenosine can't bind to them because of the caffeine. Now, overall though, damage to these inhibitory connections, prolonged damage can produce fatal insomnia. And that makes sense because if these inhibitory neurons can't secrete GABA and can't suppress arousal neurons, then you're not going to be able to sleep ever. So permanent damage can produce insomnia, which can become fatal if it's prolonged enough. Now let's look again still at control of sleep. So we have different kind of status of sleep. So homeostatic, which it's kind of just in reference to the ability to maintain a sleep and wake balance. So we need to sleep sometimes, we need to be awake sometimes. So homeostatic basically just refers to keeping things kind of business as normal and maintaining a balance between sleep and wake states. And then we also have what is called allostatic. This is being able to respond to environmental stressors, and it kind of allows a person to override the homeostatic control. So we have our basic sleep and wake states, and that is homeostatic, but if something happens and you need to be awake and alert, even if it's time to sleep, your body will kick into gear and allow you to do that, and that is referred to as allostatic control. And then something that I'm sure you all have heard of at least is circadian rhythms. So this is kind of a light-dark cycle. So basically we tend to be awake when it's light and sleep when it's dark, and those give like the light dark, the cues from outside, from the sun, and then the lack of sun gives your body a cue when to sleep and when to be awake. For the last part of this lecture, we'll discuss some disorders of sleep. The first one is one that I mentioned a few times throughout this lecture, that is insomnia. There are two types of insomnia. The first, which is primary, a general difficulty falling asleep. Then there's secondary insomnia, which is difficulty falling asleep due to some mental or physical condition. Physicians tend to treat patient reports, not observations. So basically someone tends to be treated for insomnia if they report they can't sleep, not that they've been observed and it's been determined that they don't sleep. It's just basically self-report. As you can imagine, that can cause some problems. One study found that there wasn't a difference in time slept between people who complained of insomnia and people who were just control subjects that didn't complain of insomnia at all. So that's interesting. So you have people saying that they don't sleep, but they sleep the same average time that control patients do. What they did find in that study was a difference in personality, which is really quite interesting. So things to note about insomnia is that it's not it's not something that a physician's going to observe and then diagnose. A lot of times it's just kind of treated based upon a patient report that they're not sleeping. And there is more research being done on this. But I wanted to mention this one study just because I thought it was quite interesting, because a lot of physicians are relying on self-report. It's quite interesting that a study found that there really wasn't any sleep difference between people who were saying they couldn't sleep and those that didn't complain. So it's quite interesting. The next one we move on to is sleep apnea. This is one I think that's becoming more readily understood, like not maybe not readily understood, but more of us have heard of it at this point. Basically, this happens when breathing during sleep stops. And this seems to happen with most people, especially snorers at some point in the night. It's caused by some form of airway obstruction, either in the nose or in the throat. This can be corrected through surgery. A lot of people can find relief of this condition if it becomes, obviously, if it becomes severe enough that someone could actually suffocate in their sleep. Um, the surgery is an option, but a lot of folks opt for something called a CPAP machine, which is a breathing apparatus. And some of them are more involved than others. Some of them completely cover the face, some of them only cover the nose, but basically they provide the person with oxygen throughout the night to encourage less airway obstruction. There's also mouthpieces that can be worn that position a jaw in such a way that it will keep the jaw more open, and it will in turn keep the airway more open so the person can breathe better through the night. Next, we have narcolepsy, which is one that I mentioned earlier. This is a neurological disorder, and it's related to or correlated with that degeneration of the orexin neurotransmitter that I mentioned earlier. It seems as though this is related to mutations of a gene in chromosome 6. And again, this chromosome is for orexin receptors. What happens with narcolepsy is the person kind of falls asleep whenever. And most of the time, it's obviously in very inappropriate times. I mean, someone could be driving a car and fall asleep. Someone could be walking in the middle of a room and just fall down on the floor asleep. And then there is something called cataplexy. This is where someone basically experiences muscle paralysis that would be common in REM sleep, but it happens during a wakeful state. So this is usually preceded by some high emotional state. So someone becomes very shocked or very excited. Some highly emotional event happens, and then they are awake, but they experience muscle paralysis. And then finally, so we have sleep paralysis here in this section, and this is a symptom of narcolepsy. Some of you all may be familiar with this, some of you may have even experienced this, but people describe this as being terrifying. Basically, what happens with this is that someone is awake and they are aware that they're awake, but they can't move. They're still experiencing paralysis of sleep or muscle paralysis. But they're aware of that. They're aware they're awake, but they can't move no matter how much they want to move. This can be treated with antidepressant medications, but it is something to note that this can affect REM sleep if this is done. Now we have REM sleep behavior disorder. This basically is related to no paralysis during REM sleep. So if you think about REM sleep, that is the time in which you are dreaming. That is the time in which you are, not actually seeing things. There's no activity in V1 of your brain. So you're not getting any visual input, but you are seeing things or having visual hallucinations in your brain. You're having activity in V2. So it's good that you are typically experiencing muscle paralysis during REM sleep, because you may get up and start actually acting out your dream. Well, that's what happens with folks that experience REM sleep behavior disorder. They don't have paralysis that typically goes along with REM sleep. So they actually may get up and start moving around and acting out their dream. This seems to be a neurodegenerative disorder with a genetic component. So it seems as though there is a genetic component to this. So if you have family members that have had this, it's more likely that you may have it, for example. This becomes common in also in Parkinson's patients. Lastly, we'll talk about issues with slow wave sleep. First, we'll look at bedwetting, and this is something that is happening more with children. but this involves obviously wetting the bed during deep sleep or slow wave sleep. Then we also have something that looks similar to REM sleep disorder. It also has a genetic component like REM sleep disorder can, but as an important distinguishing factor here is that sleepwalking is not dream acting. Someone who sleepwalks typically just moves around, but they're not actually acting out a dream. Whereas someone with REM sleep disorder is actively acting out a dream that they're having. That is one big distinguishing factor between the two. And then finally, we have night terrors. Night terrors for a parent can be terrifying because, again, this is another one that seems to be much more common in children. And what you'll notice is that all of a sudden the child will be, obviously asleep, and then they will be thrashing around in their bed. They'll be screaming. It will seem like something is really wrong. They must be having a horrible nightmare. Something must be terribly wrong. You go in to check on them, and you notice that they're dead asleep. They don't know what's going on at all, and typically they don't wake up. So this is something that I've seen my own children experience. My first two, I noticed this probably between a year and 2 years of age. And at first, especially with my first child, it was really terrifying. But then I started to recognize over time that they weren't aware that this was happening. And it is just a very common childhood experience with slow wave sleep. And it is something that does stop for most children. I mean, that's something that I noticed with my first two kiddos is that it only happened for a fairly short period of time, and then they didn't experience it anymore. So while it can look very scary, it seems to be a very normal part of childhood development. So all of the ones here that I mentioned above, these three, are most common in children and thus seem to kind of weed themselves out as a child gets older. There is one that is not most common in children that happens in adults, and that's sleep eating. This is exactly what it sounds like. Someone will be in deep sleep, slow wave sleep, and they will get up and actually go get food and eat. So if you ever wake up and you see a box of Cheerios and it's open and there are Cheerios all over your floor in the kitchen, you might be sleep eating. I've actually known someone who experienced this, and she had to start like locking her pantry and stuff at night because she was eating so much in her sleep. Just as a side note, sleep eating can respond to a dopaminergic agonist, so a medication that encourages dopamine activity, or basically just helps dopamine, can decrease the instances of sleep eating. So that is all for this chapter. Make sure to look through this chapter carefully as always, and I will be back with you next week with a new content folder. Have a great day.